Again, surely everyone has heard the phrase the New World before. And what we are really talking about here is European expansion beyond the political and geographic boundaries of Europe itself. The New World is not a real place, and it's also kind of an unfortunate name, and for reasons that we'll talk about. But we're going to talk a little bit about North and South America as part of this, but only after talking about Africa and India. Now, Portugal is the central figure during the early era of exploration. This actually makes a lot of sense as Portugal is located right on the Atlantic coast. The globe in the center, the arrow is pointing to Portugal, and Portugal is a sea power. Beginning in the 1440s, Portuguese sailors were moving south along the African coast through the islands that are just off the northwest coast, the Azores and the Cape Verde Islands. There's a man named Henry the Navigator, and he figures out the currents in these areas, and this allows other Portuguese sailors to get even further in their own explorations. He is followed by a man named Bartholomew Diaz in 1487. And Diaz figures out that you can sail all the way around the tip of Africa by using ocean currents. And if you can get around the tip of Africa, you can probably get all the way to India. Now, Diaz doesn't make it that far, but he turns around once he figures out how to get around the tip of Africa, and he reports this back to Europe. 10 years after that, Vasco da Gama makes it all the way around to India. He trades, and then he returns to Europe, and he returns to Europe alive. And that's a very fine distinction because there's plenty of people that go out on trips or trying to explore things and die on the way or die without completing their task. So what ends up happening here is everyone knows how to get to India. They know how to use the kind of hug the African coast all the way around and use the currents to do so. But Portugal controls all of these ports, way sites along the coast. And from the Azores, essentially all the way to India, you have to stop in Portuguese ports um, or make use of Portuguese harbors for safety along the way. And both Portugal and Spain are looking to control trade, and they're looking to exploit the places they've claimed. And in the Azores and Cape Verde Islands, they begin to import sugar as a crop. They build these huge plantations, and the native populations on these islands are eradicated through a combination of forced labor and exposure to um, European culture, European diseases. And this is the very beginning of what would eventually grow into the system of transatlantic slavery that I'm sure everyone is at least somewhat familiar with. Africans are imported to these islands by the Portuguese to replace native populations that have been swept away by disease and conquest. So, the idea of imperialism and what I like to call ecological imperialism is not limited exclusively to people. It's also includes the natural environment as well, where you have native fauna being replaced with cash crops of one type or another. In this particular situation, we're talking about sugarcane, and it is an incredibly labor intensive crop and requires lots of manual labor to process successfully and make it turn a profit on. So you get into a little bit of a feedback where a colonial power is trying to exploit some resource, but they also have the labor issue that is either making it difficult or impossible. Now, this process of establishing a transatlantic slave trade, it takes quite a while, but slowly and surely slavery becomes one of the significant features of the Atlantic quote unquote New World. Slavery is not, it's important for you to understand this. Slavery is not some unique American phenomenon. Millions of slaves enter Brazil and South America. In fact, more slaves then were ever even imported into the United States, were shipped to places like Brazil and into the islands of the Caribbean. And in some ways, that's a shame because there tends to be this fixation with slavery in the United States and in the United States in the 18th and 19th century, and no, it doesn't seem to be quite the focus paid to the millions of slaves that are put into South America at the same time. Or excuse me, not at the same time, it's beforehand, but still the sheer numbers of people that are transported. That red arrow at the top is pointing to little old Spain and Portugal, where a lot of this is headquartered. Let's back up for a second and consider the whole concept of discovery, quote unquote, of the New World. Now, much credit is given to Christopher Columbus in 1492, and certainly in 1492 he did have his little voyage, but the Vikings had multiple colonies in North America from about 985 to 1005 AD. And this is a full 400 years before Columbus is even born. So this is not to mention the fact also that there are literally millions and millions of people living in both North and South America, and they had been there for tens of thousands of years. So the whole idea of discovery really hinges on your personal perspective of discovery, the European discovery of something, the uh, discovery of unknown land. There's a lot of cultural baggage associated with the idea of the discovery of the New World. Just beware of that. Now let's consider Christopher Columbus. Yes, he reached Cuba in 1492, but he didn't discover anything that someone did not know was there already. And in fact, you could argue that the natives found Christopher Columbus because Columbus was lost um, at sea. So, in any case, Columbus is a very complicated figure, and it's can be hard to separate a lot of the BS from the reality of his history. Everyone knows the basic story. I mean, this is drilled into your head from preschool right on up, and so we're not going to go into that. But we will look at some of the results of his actions in the quote unquote New World. So, on his first trip, he meets some natives. These are Arawak Indians. They're living in the Caribbean. And he thinks that these natives are really nice folks. And when he gets back to report to his minders, he says, "Yeah, these guys over there in the Indies can be made Christians really easily. They don't have any religion like we do, and they're eager to become Christians, and it's going to be great. And we expect to find gold and valuables, and it's just wonderful going over there." And Columbus goes on to make four more total voyages. And what's amazing is how fast everything changes. Because by the end of his second voyage, he's no longer talking about how nice people are and how great everything is going to be. Now he's talking about how these nice Indian folks can be valuable as slaves. And by the time of the fourth voyage, rape, murder, literally feeding natives to dogs has become kind of a commonplace activity. So, again, depending on your perspective, Columbus can be this uh, daring figure who doesn't back down from a challenge, or he can be a genocidal murderer. It's just interesting to think about the whole parts of the story. Now they're finding this land across the ocean, and Spain and Portugal begin to bicker over who should get claim to all of this. They're both Atlantic powers, and the result is two back-to-back proclamations and agreements set up by Pope Alexander VI. And under the Treaty of Tordesillas, Portugal lays claim to everything east of a demarcation line which passes through South America. And everything west of this line, and the line moves twice. That's why I say two treaties. In 1493, it's way out there on the edge, and in 1494, they move it to the final location, which kind of passes through South South America. Anyway, this everything west of the line is claimed by Spain, and everything east of that line is claimed by Portugal. In fact, that's the reason that Portuguese is still the official language spoken in Brazil instead of Spanish, because that side of South America fell under the Portuguese instead of the Spanish. Now, unfortunately for all of the natives living in both North and South America, the Pope also decides that all of the, he called them barbarous nations, might be overthrown and made Christians. These people all had fully formed functional societies. They had religious beliefs and all of this stuff, but because they were not Christians, it was deemed just null and void just by virtue of its nature. And so, by papal authority, they could be overthrown even by violent methods. And since they're not Christians, they cannot be legitimate owners of the land. And if you stop and kind of divorce yourself from it for just a second, because it's kind of an emotionally gut-wrenching thing to think about, but it makes perfect sense to the mind of uh, religious authority at that time. So think about the position of Spain, right? We're talking 1492. We're talking 1492. The Reconquista ends. And it ends with the final expulsion of all Muslims from Spain, and they did this by war, and a war that had been extremely savage, extremely nasty. And in fact, the day before Christopher Columbus set sail, Jews in Spain were ordered to convert or die. And by the time Columbus had returned to Europe, more than 30,000 Jews had been burned at the stake. So religion and violence is very tightly joined in all of these overseas expansion programs. In 1501, Amerigo Vespucci figures out that South America is actually a continent, and here's where we inherit the name, or his name rather, for the Americas, and that's the way it remains to this day. I've already said there are millions of people living in the Americas, and for the purposes of this discussion, I'm really going to be concerned with the people that are living in Central and South America and Spain, specifically the Aztecs, which are found in Mexico. That would be the one on the left, and the Inca found in uh, coastal South America. That would be the one on the bottom. The Maya have already experienced kind of a social upheaval, and they're not a political military they're still there, people still exist, they're living on the land, but they're not a political and military entity in the same respect as the Aztecs and Inca. So we're going to focus on those two. The Aztec Empire stretched across central Mexico from one side to the other, so from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, and they had one of the largest and most powerful militaries on the planet at that time. And they're probably the most powerful military in the New World at this time. And they have a very unique worldview, and it's based on an extremely violent cosmology. Um, the belief was that there was a moon goddess, and she's kind of a mother figure, and she is killed and dismembered. And the other Aztec gods are created or they're born from this event. And so violence becomes seen as a regenerative force. So you use violence as a way of um, keeping the universe going, of making sure that everything in the universe continues to function the way it should. And the other gods that come out of this event, the Aztec gods, are actually kind of like us, kind of like humans. They can make mistakes, they can learn things, they can have moral epiphanies, they can develop personally, while at the same time they are still, divine beings. And they have gods for virtually everything. The two most important, which is Huitzilopochtli, which is on the left-hand side there, is a war god, very, very important to the Aztecs. And then there's Tualac on the right-hand side, which is a water and fertility god. And if you're, growing a lot of crops, you're just basic agriculture, you're going to definitely be interested in water and fertility. But these gods, in order to continue to survive, need they need a constant infusion or constant source of blood. It's just part of the regenerative cycle. Now, the Aztecs have a very different type of warfare, something that you would not recognize almost as warfare in the kind of traditional Western civilization sense. And they called it the Flower War. And the idea here is to take captives live captives, instead of just destroying everything and laying waste to the countryside. So they use non-lethal weapons, kind of shock weapons, and they're kind of collecting tributes rather than exterminating an enemy. So put this in contrast to the type of warfare that's been practiced in Europe up until that same time, right? Think about the Crusades and the Hundred Years' War, these extremely savage wars where it's not out of line to think that one side is trying to quite literally exterminate the other side. Now, the captives that are acquired during the Flower War are later sacrificed to the various gods of the Aztec pantheon. Sometimes these people are um, eaten, dismembered, and shared amongst family groups and things of that. But you have to remember they've got a different way of viewing the universe. Um, they view blood as kind of a food for the gods, and death as a sign of piety and respect. And their whole culture is built around this idea of maintaining the universe with blood and sacrifice. Now, we look back at this and we think about, oh, how horrible this is that they're doing this. But remember, these folks grew, their civilization grew with no Judeo Christian tradition. It's not as if they had been exposed to the ideas of Western civilization and had rejected them. These ideas had never been part of anything they had ever known. So um, you can't, read backwards. One of the things you cannot do is read your uh, personal feelings back into history. That's not how it works. The best thing you can say is they did not have a Judeo-Christian tradition. You can't say they were evil and terrible people because of it. That's just not how history works. If you want to make those claims, you have to go and find the philosophy department, because that's not what historians do. Now, this ritual sacrifice is also a way to demonstrate political power. The Aztecs had these great big um, racks of skulls on stakes all around their temples called Pantli, and you would have hundreds and hundreds of skulls kind of skewered on these stakes. It's pretty clear they're sending a message to all of these surrounding people concerning their power and connection to the divine, right? And we've recently discovered some of the foundations, the bases for these racks and these skulls with holes in them that were hanging out on displays. And it's not surprising that some of the Aztecs' neighbors did not like it, for obvious reasons, right? So the Aztecs had actually been at war with their neighbors, the Tlaxcalans, for a while. And so when the Spanish arrive in the Valley of Mexico, they're coming in right at the tail end of a whole bunch of warfare between the Aztecs and their neighbors. In 1519, Hernan Cortes leads a group of Spanish conquistadors overland into the Valley of Mexico to contact the Aztecs. And this leads to the complete destruction of the entire Aztec civilization. Cortes was kind of a rough and tumble adventurer type figure. He burned his ships to the waterline when he arrived on the coast before he set off, and that way his men had no chance but to follow him and succeed at that. When he and his men reach Mexico City, they rapidly kind of insult the Aztecs, and initially they actually run for their lives. They're kind of chased away by the Aztecs, um, but he returns and overthrows the Aztecs. What is amazing is that he crushes one of the most powerful and large armies on Earth with just a few hundred men and horses. And this has been the subject of so much discussion and argument among historians. The simple fact of the matter is that in an even contest between the Aztecs and Cortez and his conquistadors, the Aztecs would have steamrollered right over the Spanish with almost no effort at all. But what you have to remember is the Aztecs are fighting with a very different type of purpose. Sure, the Aztecs have had war for conquest and domination before, but that is not their default setting. The Spanish, on the other hand, these are all men that have been trained in combat during the Reconquista. And the Reconquista is essentially a religious war of extermination, right? They've been trained in all of the trappings of that kind of war, the extreme violence and the just unimaginable brutality that that kind of war encompasses. And by the time the Aztecs are fully aware of the type of fight that they're in, that it's kind of a fight for extermination, it's really too late for them. And the Spanish are definitely using technology that is not available to the Aztecs. They have horses, they have steel weapons, they have dogs that are trained to kill and eat people. But they also have about 40,000 Tlaxcalan volunteers. And if you look in this painting, it's out of one of the Aztec codexes, or it's an illustration, not a painting, excuse me. But you look at that red arrow, it shows all of these warriors that are marching along behind the Spanish. So it's not as if Cortez kind of comes bopping down the road with a couple of his buddies and they overthrow this Aztec empire. They had an awful lot of help. The Tlaxcalans are absolutely sick of the Aztecs, and they're more than ready to get rid of them, even if it means throwing their lot in with the Spanish. Now, it doesn't work out for them in the long run, but in the short run, I am absolutely certain that the Tlaxcalans were absolutely happy to be rid of the Aztecs. Spain also had a lot of little helpers, and comes in the form of European diseases. The Aztecs had no immunity to smallpox or even simple diseases, things that we kind of dismiss almost in the modern day, things like mumps and measles. And the Spanish conquistadors also brought along with them some horrible sexually transmitted diseases, things like syphilis. And tertiary syphilis, the virus actually kind of consumes the sufferer's body, and you can see that in that skull that's just kind of turned to Swiss cheese. Um, it's a horrible, horrible disease. They bring animal diseases, things like anthrax. So while these diseases may be unintentional, at least in this instance, they are extremely effective. Now, the other large civilization to meet the Spanish were the Inca on the west coast of South America. And their culture is built around the worship of the sun and a kind of strict observance of stars and stellar alignments and things of this nature. And unlike the Aztecs, the Inca emperor, also called the Sapa Inca, was considered a god. And the emperor himself was considered a direct descendant of Inti, which is the sun god. And you see him on the right-hand side there, represented as kind of a disk, sun disk. Inca have no written language, but they kept records on these huge cords with a series of knots tied in them. And this is how they kept their records. And these were called quipu. They were also master builders. They terraced whole mountainsides to create usable land for growing crops. And in Inca society, tribute came in the form of labor, not blood, like in the Aztec society. When conquered, whole populations would be uprooted and resettled in different valleys or different mountainous areas to work in agriculture. Warfare could be extremely violent between Aztec peoples. Some of the conquered people would be, or there's records at least, of some of the conquered being forced to watch their generals' um, hearts being ripped out, and then other captives being forced to eat it, and things like that. So there's definitely record of some pretty extreme violence, torture, and execution. But on the whole, the type of warfare being practiced by the Inca is not like the Western style of war that we've been talking about, where you've got these whole cultures trying to exterminate each other. Now, the Sapa Inca, this kind of supreme ruler, again, like I said, was considered a god. And these rulers, the Sapa Inca, after death were mummified. And mummification in this part of the world is actually very easy to do because of the dry air in the environment. You can actually just bundle up a mummy and leave it exposed, and it will kind of naturally mummify, like you see in the center section there. After death, these rulers, the Sapa Inca, are maintained, even though they're a mummy, they're maintained as if they're still alive. People will bring them food, they'll carry them around on litters, they get to keep their possessions and homes and staffs, etc. So you can see in this drawing on the left-hand side, the Sapa Inca and wife are being carried around in life, and then you can see on the right-hand side, he's been kind of transformed into this mummy bundle. He's dead, but he's still being carried around with the same kind of finery and respect, even though he's a mummy. And these mummies, the system of royal mummies, is gigantically expensive, and that system tended to generate lots of internal conflict, especially between the heirs um, to the imperial position. You got to remember that they're tracing their family line straight back from Inti, the sun god. So it's definitely a position you want to become associated with in this society. When the Spanish arrive in Peru in the 1530s, that's exactly what they're coming into. They're coming in right at the tail end of a huge civil war between two brothers. One is called Huascar, and the other one is Atahualpa. And the there's really no love lost between these two brothers. They've been fighting with each other, and the the Spanish arrive led by two brothers themselves, the Pizarro brothers, Francisco being the more important of the two. And the Pizarro brothers served under Cortez, right? So they've trained in the way of the Mexican contest. They're used to using extreme violence and killing people to effect these conquests. And Pizarro is actually clever enough to use some of those diseases brought from the old world as almost biological weapons against the natives, and distributing blankets that were infected with smallpox and things like that. And Atahualpa kills Huascar rather than uniting with him against the Spanish. And because you've got this fractured system that is fighting amongst itself, a lot like you had internal conflict with the Aztecs and their neighbors, the Spanish can exploit that to their benefit. After Atahualpa kills Huascar, then Francisco Pizarro kills Atahualpa. The conquest of the Inca takes much longer than the conquest of the Aztecs because of the royal mummies. The Inca continue to hide and move these royal mummies around, and no one really considers themselves conquered and defeated as long as they still have these Sapa Inca floating around. The Spanish burn any mummy that they can find, and the royal mummies are essentially destroyed by the Spanish. So the conquest in Peru is not really considered complete until 1572. Afterwards, the Spanish set up a system of administration throughout South and Central America, and they built these gigantic plantations called encomienda. And the natives are expected to move onto an encomienda, convert to Christianity, and then work for the Spanish landowner, either in agriculture or in mining. Um, Mining being extremely important because the Spanish and the Portuguese are almost obsessed with extraction of resources from the New World to send back to the Old World, particularly in gold and silver. And this system does not work in the way it was intended to work. And mostly because of massive fraud and gross abuse by the Spanish. And these are the same men that are steeped in the ultraviolence of the conquests and the Reconquista before that, and violence and abuse is kind of normal. And clergy actually sees things going on in the New World that are kind of horrifying. They report that people are having noses, hands, ears, breasts cut off. There's people being burned alive, children fed to dogs when parents can't meet the quotas set by the landowners and things like that. And these drawings on the left and on the bottom show kind of these classic things reported by the clergy. Just horrible, horrible stuff. But the most famous record of these abuses is the work of Bartolomeu de las Casas. He was a priest. He wrote a book called The Destruction of the Indies. And the things that were going on after the conquest were actually bad enough that the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V steps in and declares a whole set of laws to protect the natives. The problem is by then it's entirely too late. All of the native societies in Central and South America are completely destroyed. The Arawak Indians in the Caribbean are completely destroyed. And when I say destroyed, I mean culturally and population wise. And that's part of the reason that Europeans turn to African slave labor is because of this conquest. You know, they have obliterated the native inhabitants of the New World with warfare and disease and all of this other, and there has to be someone to provide manual labor. And it's almost a kind of cruel irony because the natives of the New World avoid slavery because they're dead. So, but it also shows how you get into this system of transatlantic slavery, which we will talk about more later.